Section 8 of the Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals by Charles Darwin. Chapter 4, Means of Expression in Animals, Part 2. We thus see how generally throughout the two higher vertebrate classes, and with some reptiles, the dermal appendages are erected under the influence of anger and fear. The movement is effected, as we know from Colliker's interesting discovery, by the contraction of minute, unstriped, involuntary muscles, often called erectores pili, which are attached to the capsules of the separate hairs, feathers, etc. By the contraction of these muscles, the hairs can be instantly erected, as we see in a dog, being at the same time drawn a little out of their sockets. They are afterwards quickly depressed. The vast number of these minute muscles over the whole body of a hairy quadruped is astonishing. The erection of the hair is, however, aided in some cases, as with that on the head of a man, by the striped and voluntary muscles of the underlying panniculus carnosus. It is by the action of these latter muscles that the hedgehog erects its spines. It appears also from the researches of Leydig and others that striped fibers extend to the panniculus of some of the larger hairs, such as the vibrissae of certain quadrupeds. The erectores pili contract not only under the above emotions, but from the application of cold to the surface. I remember that my mules and dogs, brought from a lower and warmer country, after spending a night on the bleak Cordillera, had the hairs all over their bodies as erect as under the greatest terror. We see the same action in our own goose skin during the chill before a fever fit. Mr. Lister has also found that tickling a neighboring part of the skin causes the erection and protrusion of the hairs. From these facts it is manifest that the erection of the dermal appendages is a reflex action, independent of the will, and this action must be looked at when occurring under the influence of anger or fear, not as a power acquired for the sake of some advantage, but as an incidental result, at least to a large extent, of the sensorium being affected. The result, in as far as it is incidental, may be compared with the profuse sweating from an agony of pain or terror. Nevertheless, it is remarkable how slight an excitement often suffices to cause the hair to become erect, as when two dogs pretend to fight together in play. We have also seen a large number of animals belonging to widely distinct classes that the erection of the hair or feathers is almost always accompanied by various voluntary movements, by threatening gestures, opening the mouth, uncovering the teeth, spreading out of the wings and tail by birds, and by the utterance of harsh sounds, and the purpose of these voluntary movements is unmistakable. Therefore, it seems hardly credible that the coordinated erection of the dermal appendages, by which the animal is made to appear larger and more terrible to its enemies or rivals, should be altogether an incidental or purposeless result of the disturbance of the sensorium. This seems almost as incredible as that the erection by the hedgehog of its spines, or of the quills by the porcupine, or of the ornamental plumes by many birds during their courtship, should all be purposeless actions. We here encounter a great difficulty. How can the contraction of the unstriped and involuntary erectores pili have been coordinated with that of various voluntary muscles for the same purpose? If we could believe that the erectores primordially had been voluntary muscles and had since lost their stripes and become involuntary, the case would be comparatively simple. I am not, however, aware that there is any evidence in favor of this view, although the reversed transition would not have presented any great difficulty, as the voluntary muscles are in an unstriped condition in the embryos of the higher animals and in the larvae of some crustaceans. Moreover, in the deeper layers of the skin of adult birds, the muscular network is, according to Leydig, in a transitional condition, the fibers exhibiting only indications of transverse striation. Another explanation seems possible. We may admit that originally the erectores pillae were slightly acted on in a direct manner under the influence of rage and terror by the disturbance of the nervous system, as is undoubtedly the case with our so-called goose skin before a fever fit. Animals have been repeatedly excited by rage and terror during many generations, and consequently the direct effects of the disturbed nervous system on the dermal appendages will almost certainly have been increased through habit and through the tendency of nerve force to pass readily along accustomed channels. We shall find this view of the force of habit strikingly confirmed in a future chapter, where it will be shown that the hair of the insane is affected in an extraordinary manner, owing to their repeated accesses of fury and terror. As soon as with animals the power of erection had thus been strengthened or increased, they must often have seen the hairs or feathers erected in rival and enraged males, and the bulk of their bodies thus increased. In this case it appears possible that they might have wished to make themselves appear larger and more terrible to their enemies by voluntarily assuming a threatening attitude and uttering harsh cries, such attitudes and utterances after a time becoming through habit instinctive. In this manner, actions performed by the contraction of voluntary muscles might have been combined for the same special purpose with those effected by involuntary muscles. It is even possible that animals, when excited and dimly conscious of some change in the state of their hair, might act on it by repeated exertions of their attention and will. For we have reason to believe that the will is able to influence in an obscure manner the action of some unstriped or involuntary muscles, as in the period of the peristaltic movements of the intestines and in the contraction of the bladder. Nor must we overlook the part which variation and natural selection may have played, for the males which succeeded in making themselves appear the most terrible to their rivals or to their other enemies, if not of overwhelming power, will on an average have left more offspring to inherit their characteristic qualities, whatever these may be and however first acquired, than have other males. The inflation of the body and other means of exciting fear in an enemy. Certain amphibians and reptiles, which either have no spines to erect or no muscles by which they can be erected, enlarge themselves when alarmed or angry by inhaling air. This is well known to be the case with toads and frogs. The latter animal is made, in Aesop's fable of the ox and the frog, to blow itself up from vanity and envy until it burst. This action must have been observed during the most ancient times, as, according to Mr. Hensley Wedgwood, the word toad expresses in all the languages of Europe the habit of swelling. It has been observed with some of the exotic species in the zoological gardens, and Dr. Gunther believes that it is general throughout the group. Judging from analogy, the primary purpose probably was to make the body appear as large and frightful as possible to an enemy, but another and perhaps more important secondary advantage is thus gained. When frogs are seized by snakes, which are their chief enemies, they enlarge themselves wonderfully, so that if the snake be of small size, as Dr. Gunther informs me, it cannot swallow the frog, which thus escapes being devoured. Chameleons and some other lizards inflate themselves when angry. Thus, a species inhabiting Oregon, the Tapia douglasii, is slow in its movements and does not bite, but has a ferocious aspect. When irritated, it springs in a most threatening manner at anything pointed at it, at the same time opening its mouth wide and hissing audibly, after which it inflates its body and shows other marks of anger. Several kinds of snakes likewise inflate themselves when irritated. The puff adder, Clotho aritans, is remarkable in this respect, but I believe, after carefully watching these animals, that they do not act thus for the sake of increasing their apparent bulk, but simply for inhaling a large supply of air, so as to produce their surprisingly loud, harsh, and prolonged hissing sound. The cobras de capello, when irritated, enlarge themselves a little and hiss moderately, but at the same time they lift their heads aloft and dilate by means of their elongated anterior ribs the skin on each side of the neck into a large flat disc, the so-called hood. With their widely opened mouths, they then assume a terrific aspect. The benefit thus derived ought to be considerable in order to compensate for the somewhat lessened rapidity, though this is still great, with which, when dilated, they can strike at their enemies or prey, on the same principle that a broad, thin piece of wood cannot be moved through the air so quickly as a small, round stick. An innocuous snake, the Travodontatus macrophthalmus, an inhabitant of India, likewise dilates its neck when irritated, and consequently is often mistaken for its compatriot, the deadly cobra. This resemblance perhaps serves as some protection to the Travodontatus. Another innocuous species, the Dasypeltis of South Africa, blows itself out, distends its neck, hisses, and darts at the intruder. Many other snakes hiss under similar circumstances. They also rapidly vibrate their protruded tongues, and this may aid in increasing their terrific appearance. Snakes possess other means of producing sounds besides hissing. Many years ago I observed in South America that a venomous Trigonocephalus, when disturbed, rapidly vibrated the end of its tail, which, striking against the dry grass and twigs, produced a rattling noise that could be distinctly heard at the distance of 6 feet. The deadly and fierce Echis carinata of India produces a curious, prolonged, almost hissing sound in a very different manner, namely by rubbing the sides of the folds of his body against each other, whilst the head remains in almost the same position. The scales on the sides, and not on other parts of the body, are strongly keeled, with the keels toothed like a saw, and as the coiled up animal rubs its sides together, these grate against each other. Lastly, we have the well-known case of the rattlesnake. He who has merely shaken the rattle of a dead snake can form no just idea of the sound produced by the living animal. Professor Schaller states that it is indistinguishable from that made by the male of the large cicada, an homopterous insect, which inhabits the same district. In the zoological gardens, when the rattlesnakes and puff adders were greatly excited at the same time, I was much struck at the similarity of the sound produced by them, and although that made by the rattlesnake is louder and shriller than the hissing of the puff adder, yet when standing at some yards' distance I could scarcely distinguish the two. For whatever purpose the sound is produced by the one species, I can hardly doubt that it serves for the same purpose in the other species, and I conclude from the threatening gestures made at the time by many snakes that their hissing, the rattling of the rattlesnake and of the tail of the Trigonocephalus, the grating of the scales of the Echis, and the dilation of the hood of the cobra, all subserve the same end, namely, to make them appear terrible to their enemies. It seems at first a probable conclusion that venomous snakes, such as the foregoing, from being already so well defended by their poison fangs, would never be attacked by any enemy, and consequently would have no need to excite additional terror. But this is far from being the case, for they are largely preyed on in all quarters of the world by many animals. It is well known that pigs are employed in the United States to clear districts infested with rattlesnakes, which they do most effectually. In England, the hedgehog attacks and devours the viper. In India, as I hear from Dr. Jerdon, several kinds of hawks and at least one mammal, the herpestes, kill cobras and other venomous species, and so it is in South Africa. Therefore, it is by no means improbable that any sounds or signs by which the venomous species could instantly make themselves recognized as dangerous would be of more service to them than to the innocuous species, which would not be able, if attacked, to inflict any real injury. Having said thus much about snakes, I am tempted to add a few remarks on the means by which the rattle of the rattlesnake was probably developed. Various animals, including some lizards, either curl or vibrate their tails when excited. This is the case with many kinds of snakes. In the zoological gardens, an innocuous species, the Coronella sayi, vibrates its tail so rapidly that it becomes almost invisible. The Trigonocephalus, before alluded to, has the same habit, and the extremity of its tail is a little enlarged, or ends in a bead. In the Lachesis, which is so closely allied to the rattlesnake that it was placed by Linnaeus in the same genus, the tail ends in a single large lancet-shaped point or scale. With some snakes, the skin, as Professor Schaller remarks, is more imperfectly detached from the region about the tail than at any other parts of the body. Now, if we suppose that the end of the tail of some ancient American species was enlarged and was covered by a single large scale, this could hardly have been cast off at the successive molts. In this case, it would have been permanently retained, and at each period of growth, as the snake grew larger, a new scale, larger than the last, would have been formed above it and would likewise have been retained. The foundation for the development of a rattle would thus have been laid, and it would have been habitually used if the species, like so many others, vibrated its tail whenever it was irritated. That the rattle has since been specially developed to serve as an efficient sound-producing instrument, there can hardly be a doubt, for even the vertebra included within the extremity of the tail have been altered in shape and cohere. But there is no greater improbability in various structures, such as the rattle of the rattlesnake, the lateral scales of the etchus, the neck with the included ribs of the cobra, and the whole body of the puff adder, having been modified for the sake of warning and frightening away their enemies, than in a bird, namely the wonderful secretary hawk, Gypogeranus, having had its whole frame modified for the sake of killing snakes with impunity. It is highly probable, judging from what we have before seen, that this bird would ruffle its feathers whenever it attacked a snake, and it is certain that the herpestes, when it eagerly rushes to attack a snake, erects the hair all over its body, and especially that on its tail. We have also seen that some porcupines, when angered or alarmed at the sight of a snake, rapidly vibrate their tails, thus producing a peculiar sound by the striking together of the hollow quills. So that here both the attackers and the attacked endeavor to make themselves as dreadful as possible to each other, and both possessed for this purpose specialized means, which, oddly enough, are nearly the same in some of these cases. Finally, we can see that if, on the one hand, those individual snakes which were best able to frighten their enemies escaped best from being devoured, and if, on the other hand, those individuals of the attacking enemy survived in larger numbers which were the best fitted for the dangerous task of killing and devouring venomous snakes, then, in the one case as in the other, beneficial variations, supposing the characters in question to vary, would commonly have been preserved through the survival of the fittest. The drawing back and pressure of the ears to the head. The ears, through their movements, are highly expressive in many animals, but in some, such as man, the higher apes, and many ruminants, they fail in this respect. A slight difference in position serves to express in the plainest manner a different state of mind, as we may daily see in the dog. But we are here concerned only with the ears being drawn closely backward and pressed to the head. A savage frame of mind is thus shown, but only in the case of those animals which fight with their teeth. And the care with which they take to prevent their ears being seized by their antagonists accounts for this position. Consequently, through habit and association, whenever they feel slightly savage, or pretend in their play to be savage, their ears are drawn back. That this is the true explanation may be inferred from the relation which exists in very many animals between their manner of fighting and the retraction of their ears. All the carnivora fight with their canine teeth, and all, as far as I have observed, draw their ears back when feeling savage. This may be continually seen with dogs when fighting in earnest, and with puppies fighting in play. The movement is different from the falling down and slight drawing back of the ears when a dog feels pleased and is caressed by his master. The retraction of the ears may likewise be seen in kittens fighting together in their play, and in full-grown cats when really savage, as before illustrated in Figure 9. Although their ears are thus to a large extent protected, yet they often get much torn in old male cats during their mutual battles. The same movement is very striking in tigers, leopards, etc., whilst growling over their food in menageries. The lynx has remarkably long ears, and their retraction, when one of these animals is approached in its cage, is very conspicuous, and is eminently expressive of its savage disposition. Even one of the eared seals, the Ateria pusilla, which has very small ears, draws them backwards when it makes a savage rush at the legs of its keeper. When horses fight together, they use their incisors for biting and their forelegs for striking, much more than they do their hind legs for kicking backwards. This has been observed when stallions have broken loose and have fought together, and may likewise be inferred from the kind of wounds which they inflict on each other. Everyone recognizes the vicious appearance which the drawing back of the ears gives to the horse. This movement is very different from that of listening to a sound behind. If an ill-tempered horse in a stall is inclined to kick backwards, his ears are retracted from habit, though he has no intention or power to bite. But when the horse throws up both hind legs in play, as when entering an open field, or when just touched by the whip, he does not generally depress his ears, for he does not then feel vicious. Guanacos fight savagely with their teeth, and they must do so frequently, for I found the hides of several which I shot in Patagonia deeply scored. So do camels, and both these animals, when savage, draw their ears closely backwards. Guanacos, as I have noticed, when not intending to bite, but merely to spit their offensive saliva from a distance at an intruder, retract their ears. Even the hippopotamus, when threatening with its widely open enormous mouth a comrade, draws back its small ears, just like a horse. Now, what a contrast is presented between the foregoing animals and cattle, sheep, or goats, which never use their teeth in fighting, and never draw back their ears when enraged. Although sheep and goats appear such placid animals, the males often join in furious contests. As deer form a closely related family, and as I do not know that they ever fought with their teeth, I was much surprised at the account given by Major Ross King of the moose deer in Canada. He says, when, quote, two males chance to meet, laying back their ears and gnashing their teeth together, they rush at each other with appalling fury, end quote. But Mr. Bartlett informs me that some species of deer fight savagely with their teeth, so that the drawing back of the ears by the moose accords with our rule. Several kinds of kangaroos, kept in the zoological gardens, fight by scratching with their forefeet and by kicking with their hind legs, but they never bite each other, and the keepers have never seen them draw back their ears when angered. Rabbits fight chiefly by kicking and scratching, but they likewise bite each other, and I have known one to bite off half the tail of its antagonist. At the commencement of their battles they lay back their ears, but afterwards, as they bound over and kick each other, they keep their ears erect or move them much about. Mr. Bartlett watched a wild boar quarreling rather savagely with his sow, and both had their mouths opened and their ears drawn backwards. But this does not appear to be a common action with domestic pigs when quarreling. Boars fight together by striking upwards with their tusks, and Mr. Bartlett doubts whether they then draw back their ears. Elephants, which in like manner fight with their tusks, do not retract their ears, but on the contrary erect them when rushing at each other or at an enemy. The rhinoceroses in the zoological gardens fight with their nasal horns, and have never been seen to attempt biting each other except in play, and the keepers are convinced that they do not draw back their ears, like horses and dogs, when feeling savage. The following statement, therefore, by Sir S. Baker, is inexplicable, namely, that a rhinoceros which he shot in North Africa, quote, had no ears. They had been bitten off close to the head by another of the same species while fighting, and this mutilation is by no means uncommon, end quote. Lastly, with respect to monkeys. Some kinds which have movable ears and which fight with their teeth, for instance the Cereopithecus ruber, draw back their ears when irritated, just like dogs, and they then have a very spiteful appearance. Other kinds, as the Inuus echaudatus, apparently do not thus act. Again, other kinds, and this is a great anomaly in comparison with most other animals, retract their ears, show their teeth, and jabber when they are pleased by being caressed. I observed this in 2 or 3 species of Macasis and in the Cynopithecus niger. This expression, owing to our familiarity with dogs, would never be recognized as one of joy or pleasure by those unacquainted with monkeys. Erection of the ears. This movement requires hardly any notice. All animals which have the power of freely moving their ears when they are startled or when they closely observe an object, direct their ears to the point towards which they are looking, in order to hear any sound from this quarter. At the same time they generally raise their heads, as all their organs of sense are there situated, and some of the smaller animals rise on their hind legs. Even those kinds which squat on the ground or instantly flee away to avoid danger generally act momentarily in this manner in order to ascertain the source and nature of the danger. The head being raised, with erected ears and eyes directed forwards, gives an unmistakable expression of close attention to any animal. Section 8.